Okay, so let us try to understand in this video what is government, what does it do, what historical obligations the government has towards its people. The governments are now generally identified as welfareist state. Whether they are welfareist, whether they have the ability to perform their welfareist functions or not. But world over, the governments have come to be identified with welfareism. But welfareism is a very new concept. It's only in the last decade of 19th century that the welfare state developed. There might have been some welfarist state in medieval time, but they were welfarist only religiously. In secular terms, in socio-economic terms, welfare state emerged in 19th century, the last decade, 19th century, and it became more popular, widespread, especially after Great Depression, and the welfare economist as propounded by John Maynard Keynes. Most of the governments started, even capitalist governments like Franklin D. Roosevelt's government under its New Deal New Deal was technically the first, the official inauguration of welfarist state. Then it is spread to other, European countries also adopted welfarist economic model. After decolonization, the decolonized countries of Asia and Africa, they also adopted welfarist model. Whether they had the ability to do welfarism or not, but theoretically they all adopted welfarism. Fine. But no, the capacity of a welfarist state to perform its welfarist functions is not going to be determined by some emotionalism, sentimentalism. So a government might have promised that they are going to do this and that, but that is an emotional promise that can be made by the governments, especially after the adoption of electoral democracies. It became imperative on the governments, the parties forming the governments, to make some emotional promises to the people to gain or buy their votes. So, elections and electoral democracy also added a lot to the rise of welfarist state. Whether the promises could be ever fulfilled or not, but the very design of electoral democracy was such that necessitated the theoretical welfarism, but practically all the governments failed, because it is one thing to promise, make emotional promise to buy the votes of the people, that is the legitimacy of the government, but fulfilling them has always been a disaster, because fulfilling them, it is one thing, as I said, it is one thing to make the promises which are emotional and guided by your urge to come to power, to buy the votes. That is one thing, but to fulfill them, that requires economics, because the fulfillment of those promises requires generation of wealth, generation of money, and generation of money. The governments adopted two models. One, governments themselves managing the economy, production and supply and distribution, all under the control of governments. And second model, governments delegated this the space and the facilities and resources of the state to private sectors to produce. Most of the public sectors, including India, started collapsing by 1990s. It is in this background that privatization expanded in mixed economy, so-called mixed economy, and socialist economy also. Privatization to this economy is a new phenomena that happened only in 1990s. Why privatization did happen? It happened because of the collapse of public sector. Had public sector succeeded, then there would not have been privatization, liberalization, globalization, collapse of public sector. I will discuss it separately what caused the collapse of public sector, if not world over, then at least in India. In India, there was specific reason, can be discussed separate. So the government has the chance to earn money either by running the economy on itself. If it decides to run the economy on itself, then the economy is going to be dominated by government industries, government corporations, that is public sector. But very few governments had that committed civil services which could have successfully run the industries and overall economy. That's why they give it more and more to private sectors. So either you could have earned money by running economy on your own through public sector, or by delegating the resources to private companies, and the wealth generated by private sectors could be taxed by the government, and tax becomes the income of the government. So government has two sources of income, either by running economy on yourself through your public sectors. So all the dividends also comes to the government, the profits, not only the taxes, but the dividends and profits also come to the government. So there is a chance of larger profit if the government is capable of running industries and economy on its own. But it rarely happened. It rarely happened that governments could run the economy successfully themselves. It happened rarely. It nowhere happened. In fact, it nowhere happened. There is example of this happening in one country only, that is China. Why did it happen in China? Why did it fail in other countries? That's a separate issue, can be discussed. So welfareism of the government depended on now, the tax coming from the private, right? Welfareism in the form of promise, it is emotion, it's an electoral strategy, but the fulfillment of the same, that requires money, income. So how do the government earns? So as I said, either they earn by running the economy through PSU, or by delegating the resources, the national resources, to the private, and the wealth generated by the private, that is taxed by the government, and that forms the taxation forms the part of 70 to 80% part of government income. The remaining may be in the form of borrowing, or in the form of non-tax revenue, that is very limited tax revenue. So that is the income. So the government's ability to translate its promises, which it met mainly during electoral exercises, depends and only on its ability to tax. Now the problem is that you can tax only when there are industries, there are economic activities, vibrant economic activities. Where to tax? Whom to tax? For taxation, there must be economic activities, right? So it means that the fulfillment of the welfareist promises of the government depends on how does the government generate the money. If the governments keep on borrowing, that could also be an alternative, but by borrowing, fulfillment of welfareist promises, I mean, can go only for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Ultimately, it would lead to the death, collapse of that government economy. How long you can uh, fulfill the welfareist promises by borrowing? So borrowing can constitute maximum 3%, 4%, 5% of your total income. The government income has to be 80%, 70% tax revenue. So it means that the governments are not gods. Governments are not something which can solve all the problem. This is very much clear. This must be clear. Why we have put all our expectation on the government? It is because of our expectation that, our belief that we are paying our taxes to the government. So now government has responsibility, obligation to fulfill all our expectation. But whenever there is a mismatch between what we are paying to the taxes in the form of taxes to the government, and the deliverables from the government to the people, whenever there is a gap and mismatch, then this failure will take place. So governments are not all powerful, omnipotent bodies which can fulfill all the expectation, needs, and desires of the public. Right? So when it comes to fulfill the welfareist policies, then there must be revenue. So the ability of the governments to fulfill the welfareist promises is directly proportionate to its income. That is why whenever governments makes promise, then the people must be afraid. Similarly, I mean, people also expecting from the government, they should also be clear what is the ability of the government to fulfill. How can it do it? It can do, but only proportionate to its ability, and its ability is directly related to its tax income. In its borrowing income is also directly related to its tax income. It can borrow only on the basis of how much tax revenue it can generate. So borrowers, I mean the lenders, can also lend only when they are convinced that this government has the repayment ability, it can repay the loans. Only then the lenders can lend their money. So that's why the borrowing constitute and must constitute only a small part of government income. So what I want to conclude is that the governments are not omnipotent which can solve whatever problems we have. Government's ability to solve the problem is directly proportionate to the income the governments have. Beyond their income, they can do certain things, but only in the form of borrowing. But borrowing can go on only for 1 year, 2 years, not more than that. Borrowing also creates interest payment burden. So the governments which try to run their businesses, their affairs, their welfare systems through borrowing, disproportionate borrowing, they are bound to fail. And that's why we have numerous examples of governments having failed, collapsed, right? So that's why whenever government announces something, an awakened and enlightened citizen and an educated citizen must first question, what is the ability of the government? Does it have money? Now let us come to discuss in India, how does the government function? We have three tiers of government: central government, state government, and local government. At local government, we have two types: urban and rural. Urban government, municipal bodies, they do have their own tax sources, so they have some ability to fulfill some of their obligations related to urban planning, urban development. But rural urban governance institution, they are 98% in some cases, like in the case of states like Bihar, 98% they are dependent on what is given to them by central government and by state government. They don't have ability. Only 2% of their expectation and obligation can be fulfilled by their own tax income. In other states, it's big, like in Gujarat, in Maharashtra, Kerala, most importantly, more than 40-50% of the panchayat obligations are fulfilled by their own tax revenue, tax income, so they can do it. The state governments have their own taxes and sound taxes, but again, the expenses of state governments far exceeds their income. So the expectation from the state government is huge, but again, except some few, the state governments are like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, and Karnataka. Other states are hugely dependent on central government. Amongst them, some states are, I mean, dangerously dependent on central government. So the expenditures of a state government, even administrative expenditures of a state governments, are fulfilled from what is given by the center to the states. We have a state governments. This is the problem of having government. A government is not only it's not only about some people enjoying power. Some people are asking their secretaries to serve them. Government has an economic side. Government has a financial side. It survives. The offices survive and are visible. Power is exercised because there is money, right? So there are certain state governments which do not have money even to run their administrative expenses. For example, Bihar. I mean, I have always said that if had Bihar not been the part of India, Union of India, then there would have been civil wars in Bihar on the similar scale that we have often seen in one of some of the worst hit countries by civil war of Africa, even in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Why is it so? Because food is not a problem, but administrative expenses itself is a problem. The government of Bihar, according to its own records, can generate only 40% of its total revenue that is needed to finance its all expenses of 1 year, right? It's 1 year expenditure. If it is 100 rupees, then the ability of the government of Bihar to fulfill its 1 year expenditure is only 40%. 60% in this or that way has to come from central government. Now, if there was no such system, federal system, then Bihar government would be forced to reduce its expenses to 40%. And if that happens, then there will be civil wars. Right?